I thought I had everything under control, a loving husband, a caring family, but the night my stepson looked at me with those eyes, everything changed. His gaze held a message I wasn't prepared for, and when he reached for my hand, my world tilted on its axis. In that moment, I realized I was standing on the edge of something I never thought I'd face. 5 years ago, I married Richard, a man whose kindness and dedication captured my heart. He was everything I had ever hoped for, a loving partner and a devoted father. Richard's son, David, was just 17 when I entered their lives. Initially, our interactions were polite but distant, as he seemed guarded, a young man still grieving the loss of his mother. I knew stepping into this role would require patience and understanding. I made every effort to create a warm, welcoming environment. I'd prepare his favorite meals, listen to his stories about school, and offer gentle encouragement when he needed it. Over time, David began to open up, revealing glimpses of his thoughtful and sensitive nature. He spoke of his dreams, his challenges, and his fond memories of his mother, forging a bond that felt deeply significant. Richard, often busy with work, trusted me implicitly with David. Our little family seemed to find a rhythm, a sense of comfort and stability. I poured my heart into making our house feel like a home, a safe haven for us all. There were moments of joy that felt unshakable. Weekend dinners filled with laughter, evenings spent watching movies together, and conversations that stretched late into the night. Yet, beneath the surface, an unspoken tension began to form, a tension I couldn't fully understand or place. David started seeking my company more often, lingering in shared spaces, offering to help with chores, and always watching with a gaze that felt both appreciative and unnerving. I dismissed the unease, convincing myself it was just the natural awkwardness of adjusting to our new roles. After all, I loved Richard deeply and saw David as my own family. Everything seemed perfect on the surface, but a small seed of doubt began to grow in the corners of my mind. Little did I know, the cracks that were forming would soon shatter the illusion of harmony I had worked so hard to create. What I thought was a simple, happy life was about to unravel in ways I couldn't foresee, leaving me questioning everything I believed about family, love, and trust. As the months passed, I began noticing subtle changes in David's behavior, small, almost imperceptible shifts that left me unsettled. He started lingering in the kitchen while I cooked, sitting closer to me during movie nights, and offering to help with tasks around the house. At first, I thought it was his way of expressing gratitude for the effort I put into making our home warm and inviting. But there was something in his gaze, a lingering intensity, that I couldn't ignore. One evening, while Richard was away on a work trip, David and I sat in the living room talking. He shared stories of his mother, recounting how she understood him in ways no one else ever could. His voice carried a raw vulnerability that tugged at my heart. I reached out to comfort him, resting my hand on his. For a fleeting moment, our eyes met, and I saw something in his expression that made my stomach twist, a longing I couldn't quite place. From that night on, things began to escalate. David started finding reasons to be near me, whether it was helping with chores, asking about my day, or simply sitting in the same room in silence. I tried to convince myself that his behavior was harmless, that I was reading too much into his actions. But as time went on, his gestures became harder to dismiss. There were moments when his hand would linger on mine, or his eyes would hold my gaze for a fraction too long. One day, as I stood in the kitchen chopping vegetables, David joined me and offered to help. We worked side by side, and for the first time, I noticed the closeness between us, an almost magnetic pull. He stopped chopping and looked at me, his eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't quite name. "You've turned this house into a home," he said softly, his voice brimming with gratitude. While his words warmed my heart, a shadow of unease crept in. I laughed nervously, brushing it off with a casual remark, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. It wasn't just his actions that raised alarm bells, it was the way they made me feel. The once innocent bond we shared as stepmother and stepson now felt tinged with an unspoken tension. I started avoiding moments alone with David, yet he seemed oblivious to my discomfort. He found ways to be near me, his presence both comforting and unsettling. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, but my instincts whispered otherwise. The breaking point came one evening when David joined me on the couch with a book in hand. We laughed over the story's funny moments, but when he placed his hand on mine, I froze. His voice was soft, almost tender, as he said, "Thank you for everything you do for me." I pulled my hand away gently, forcing a smile. You don't have to thank me, David. We're family. That night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep, replaying the moment in my mind. Was it a simple gesture of gratitude, or was there something deeper at play? My mind churned with questions, and for the first time, I felt truly afraid. Afraid of what might come next, and afraid of the growing tension that threatened to upend the fragile balance of our family. Despite my efforts to maintain distance, David's behavior grew more persistent, and the tension between us deepened. I told myself repeatedly that I was imagining things, that this was nothing more than a young man seeking guidance and connection. But with each passing day, his actions became harder to dismiss, and I found myself caught in a web of confusion and discomfort. One evening, as I sat in the garden enjoying the cool breeze, David joined me unexpectedly. He settled onto the bench beside me, his presence as calm as the night air. For a while we sat in silence, but then he spoke. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he began, his voice low and introspective. "You've done so much for me, Mary. More than anyone ever has." I turned to him, unsure of what to say. "David, I care about you," I replied carefully. "We're family." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with an emotion that was both intense and unsettling. "It's more than that," he said softly, his words hanging in the air like a thundercloud before a storm. "You make me feel things I don't understand, things I know I shouldn't feel." My heart raced as his words sank in. I wanted to run, to put distance between us, but I was frozen in place, torn between fear and disbelief. "David," I said firmly, "this isn't right. I love your father, and I care for you as a mother would for her son. This has to stop." He nodded, his expression conflicted. "I know," he whispered, "but I can't help how I feel." His admission struck me like a blow, leaving me reeling. From that moment on, our interactions were fraught with tension. David sought out my company more than ever, finding excuses to be near me. When I folded laundry, he would offer to help. If I was in the kitchen, he'd linger, asking innocuous questions that carried an undertone I couldn't ignore. Even when Richard was home, I felt the weight of David's gaze, a silent reminder of the unspoken feelings that simmered beneath the surface. One night, after Richard left on a business trip, David knocked on my bedroom door. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. "Mary," he called softly, "I just want to talk." "Go to bed, David," I replied, my voice trembling. But he persisted. "I'm sorry for making you uncomfortable. I never meant to hurt you." I stayed silent, hoping he would leave, and after a moment, I heard his footsteps retreating down the hall. That night, I lay awake, consumed by guilt and confusion. I loved Richard deeply, and I had no intention of betraying him. Yet, I couldn't ignore the impact David's words and actions were having on me. I felt trapped, unsure of how to navigate the delicate and dangerous situation unfolding in our home. The next day, I avoided David as much as possible, immersing myself in chores to keep my mind occupied. But he was always there, finding ways to insert himself into my space. His gestures, once innocent, now felt loaded with meaning. A touch on the shoulder lingered too long. A compliment carried an undertone that made my stomach churn. I began questioning everything: his intentions, my responses, and even the stability of our family. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table, the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken tension. Richard, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface, chatted cheerfully about his day. David remained quiet, his gaze fixed on me. I avoided his eyes, focusing on my plate, but I could feel his attention like a weight pressing down on me. After dinner, Richard retreated to his study, leaving David and me alone in the kitchen. As I washed dishes, he approached me, his voice soft but resolute. "Mary, I need you to understand how much you mean to me," he said. I turned to him, my hands trembling. "David, this needs to stop," I said firmly. "Your feelings are natural for someone your age, but they're misplaced. You have a bright future ahead of you, and this is not the path you should take." His expression was pained, but he nodded. "I know you're right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just don't know how to move past this." "I believe you can," I said, trying to sound confident despite the turmoil inside me. "You're strong, David, and you'll find the right path." That night, I locked my bedroom door and sat on the edge of my bed, grappling with the reality of the situation. I felt torn between my duty to protect our family and my own sense of vulnerability. I knew I had to address this with Richard eventually, but the thought of shattering the fragile harmony we had built filled me with dread. As the days went on, I continued to keep my distance from David, hoping time would ease the tension. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning of a storm that would test the strength of our family in ways I could never have anticipated. The tipping point came on a night that felt no different than any other. Richard had left for another business trip, leaving David and me alone in the house. I spent the evening in the living room, trying to lose myself in a book, but my mind was restless, and every small sound seemed amplified in the silence of the house. As I sat there, I heard footsteps approaching. David entered the room, his presence filling the space with an unspoken weight. He sat down beside me, too close for comfort. "What are you reading?" he asked, his tone light but his gaze intense. I handed him the book, hoping to redirect the conversation, but he barely glanced at it before setting it aside. "Mary," he said softly, his voice carrying a gravity that made my chest tighten, "I need to talk to you." I braced myself, knowing that whatever he was about to say would only deepen the turmoil. "David, this isn't the time," I replied, my voice steady but firm. "You should go to bed." But he didn't move. Instead, he reached for my hand, his touch sending a jolt through me. "I can't keep pretending," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "You're the only person who truly understands me. The only person who makes me feel alive." His words hit me like a physical blow. I pulled my hand away, standing up quickly to put distance between us. "David, stop this," I said, my voice sharp with a mix of anger and fear. "This isn't right. I'm your stepmother, and I love your father. What you're feeling is wrong." He stood as well, his expression a mixture of desperation and defiance. "I know it's wrong, but I can't help how I feel," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm not trying to hurt anyone, Mary. I just needed you to know." My heart raced as I struggled to find the right words. "David, this has to end," I said firmly. "You need to let go of these feelings, for your sake and for the sake of our family." He nodded slowly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I never meant to make you uncomfortable. I don't know how to stop." I felt a pang of sympathy for him, but I knew I couldn't let it cloud my judgment. "You're young, David," I said gently. "You'll move past this. You have so much ahead of you. Don't let this hold you back." He didn't respond, simply turning and walking out of the room. I stood there, my hands trembling and my mind racing. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. The weight of the secret was too heavy, and the risk to our family was too great. The next morning, as Richard prepared to leave for work, I made a decision. "Richard," I said, my voice unsteady, "we need to talk." He looked at me, concern etching lines on his face. "What's wrong?" he asked. I took a deep breath, gathering my courage. "It's about David," I began. "There's something I need to tell you." As I recounted the events of the past weeks, the lingering touches, the intense gazes, and his confession, Richard listened in stunned silence. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and finally to a deep sadness. "I can't believe this," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "My son, I don't understand." "I didn't want to hurt you," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "I thought I could handle it on my own, but it's gone too far. We need to address this, together." Richard nodded, his jaw set with determination. "You're right," he said. "I need to talk to him." That evening, when David returned home, Richard called him into the living room. I stayed in the kitchen, my heart pounding as their voices drifted through the house. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was serious, laced with a mix of anger and sorrow. After what felt like an eternity, Richard came to find me. His face was pale, his eyes filled with a weariness I had never seen before. "He understands," he said quietly. "He knows what he's done is wrong." I told him he needs to take some time away, to reflect and get help. Relief washed over me, but it was tempered by a lingering sadness. "Where will he go?" I asked. "To my sister's," Richard replied. "She'll take care of him for a while." I nodded, the tension in my chest easing slightly. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope that we could move forward, that our family could heal. As David packed his things and prepared to leave, he approached me one last time. "I'm sorry, Mary," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I never wanted to cause you pain." "I know, David," I replied, my voice soft but firm. "Take this time to focus on yourself. You have so much potential. Don't let this hold you back." He nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out the door. That night, as Richard and I sat together, the weight of the past weeks finally began to lift. "We'll get through this," he said, taking my hand in his. "Together," I replied, holding on to the hope that our family could weather this storm and emerge stronger on the other side. With David gone, the house felt quieter, almost eerily so. For the first time in weeks, I could move through my days without the constant weight of his presence. Yet the silence wasn't a relief, It was a stark reminder of the fractures in our family. I knew we had done the right thing, but the emotional aftermath was heavier than I had anticipated. Richard tried his best to maintain a sense of normalcy, but I could see the strain on his face. He had always been a proud father, and now he wrestled with the reality of David's actions. Some nights, I would find him sitting alone in the living room, his head in his hands, lost in thought. When I approached him, he would force a smile, but his eyes betrayed the hurt he was carrying. "I just don't understand where I went wrong," he said one evening, his voice breaking. "David's a good kid. How could this happen?" I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "This isn't your fault, Richard," I said gently. "David is struggling with his own emotions. He needs time to figure things out, and sending him to your sisters was the right choice." Richard nodded, but I could see the doubt lingering in his expression. "I just want him to be okay," he murmured. "He's my son." While Richard grappled with his guilt, I was left to confront my own. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had failed, not just as a stepmother, but as a partner to Richard. I had kept the truth from him for too long, and now we were both paying the price. At night, I lay awake, replaying every moment in my mind, wondering if I could have done something differently to prevent this. David's absence created a void, but it also gave us space to begin rebuilding. I threw myself into the routines of daily life, cleaning, cooking, and managing the household. It was a distraction, but it wasn't enough to quiet the turmoil inside me. Everywhere I turned, there were reminders of him: the books he used to read, the chair he always sat in, the lingering scent of his cologne in the hallway. Richard and I had countless conversations about how to move forward. He insisted that I wasn't to blame, but I struggled to believe him. "You've been a wonderful stepmother," he said one night as we sat together on the couch. "You've done everything you could to make this family whole." "Maybe I tried too hard," I replied, my voice heavy with regret. "Maybe I blurred the boundaries without realizing it." "You're human, Mary," he said, taking my hand. "We all are. This isn't about blame, it's about healing." Healing, however, was easier said than done. The weight of the situation lingered like a shadow over every interaction. Even in moments of laughter, there was an undercurrent of pain. We both knew it would take time to repair what had been broken, but we were determined to try. The hardest part was knowing that this wasn't a problem we could fix on our own. David had to find his own way forward, and that meant letting go, something that was easier for me than it was for Richard. He called his sister frequently to check on David, his worry evident in every conversation. "He seems better," he said after one such call. "She says he's been keeping busy, helping around the house. But I don't know. I just wish I could see him, talk to him." "You will," I reassured him. "When the time is right." For me, the time apart was a chance to reflect. I realized how much I had been carrying: the guilt, the fear, the constant vigilance to maintain a sense of normalcy. Now, with David gone, I could finally breathe. But the scars remained, a reminder of how fragile our family had become. Weeks turned into months, and slowly the tension began to ease. Richard and I found solace in each other, leaning on our shared determination to move forward. We spent more time together, rediscovering the love that had brought us together in the first place. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of doubt and sadness, but we were committed to rebuilding what had been shaken. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Richard took my hand. "We've been through a lot," he said, his voice filled with a quiet strength. "But I believe in us. I believe we can get through anything." I nodded, a small smile breaking through the sadness. I believe that too. The journey wasn't over, and I knew it wouldn't be for a long time. David was still out there, struggling to find his way, and the impact of his actions would continue to ripple through our lives. But for the first time in months, I felt a sense of hope, a belief that we could weather the storm and come out stronger on the other side. Together, we had taken the first steps toward healing, and though the path ahead was uncertain, I knew we would face it hand in hand. As the months passed, life began to settle into a new rhythm. David stayed with Richard's sister, and though the distance was difficult for Richard, it gave us all the breathing room we desperately needed. Slowly, we began to rebuild the foundation of our family piece by piece. The pain and confusion lingered, but so did a shared determination to move forward. One morning, as I prepared breakfast, Richard walked into the kitchen holding his phone. "David wants to talk," he said cautiously. I froze for a moment, unsure of how to respond. The mere mention of his name brought a rush of emotions: relief, fear, and a lingering sadness. "What did he say?" I asked quietly. "He apologized," Richard replied, his voice tinged with both hope and sorrow. He said he's been reflecting a lot and wants to make amends. He's also started therapy. My sister says it's been helping. Hearing this brought a mix of emotions. I was glad David was taking steps toward healing, but the wounds he had left in our family were still fresh. That's a good start, I said, managing a small smile. It's what he needs. Richard nodded, his expression softening. He's still my son, Mary. I want to believe he can move past this and become the person I know he's capable of being. I want that too, I replied. For all of us. Over the next few weeks, David began calling regularly. At first, his conversations with Richard were brief and strained, but as time went on, they grew longer and more heartfelt. I stayed in the background, unsure of how to re-enter the relationship. I knew I had forgiven him in my heart, but I wasn't ready to face him directly. Eventually, the day came when David asked to visit. Richard and I discussed it at length, weighing the risks and rewards. If he's truly ready, we should give him the chance, Richard said. But only if you're comfortable. I hesitated, my mind racing with memories of everything that had happened. But I also knew that healing required courage and vulnerability. Okay, I agreed. Let's take it one step at a time. When David arrived, the tension in the air was palpable. He stood in the doorway, looking older and more subdued than I remembered. Hi, he said softly, his gaze flickering between us. Thank you for letting me come. Richard pulled him into a hug, his emotions spilling over. It's good to see you, son, he said, his voice thick with emotion. When David turned to me, I offered a tentative smile. Hello, David. I'm sorry, he said immediately, his voice trembling. For everything. I never wanted to hurt you or Dad. I've been working hard to understand myself and to change. His sincerity was clear, and for the first time, I felt a sense of peace. Thank you, David, I said gently. I hope you continue to find your way. As the visit progressed, the three of us talked openly, addressing the pain but also focusing on the future. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of awkwardness and tears, but it felt like a step in the right direction. By the time he left, I could see the weight lifting from Richard's shoulders, and for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope for our family's future. The experience taught me a profound lesson about the resilience of love and the importance of boundaries. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild, but with honesty and effort, it's possible to find a way forward. As a family, we learned that healing requires courage, vulnerability, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Now, as I sit here reflecting on everything we've been through, I feel a deep sense of gratitude. Though the journey was painful, it brought us closer together and taught us the value of open communication and forgiveness. Life isn't perfect, and it never will be, but we're stronger now, individually and as a family. Sometimes the most difficult challenges are the ones that teach us the most. And while I wouldn't wish this experience on anyone, I'm proud of how far we've come. Together, we faced the storm, and together we've begun to heal. If you were in her position, how would you handle it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories that explore the complexities of relationships and the human experience. Stay tuned. Our next story will take you on another emotional roller coaster that you won't want to miss.